All right, we're back with Matthew 26. I believe that's where we left off. Matthew 26.
It's been a while.
In Matthew 25, there's a whole lot of red in chapter 25. He's talking about all kinds of parables, but we're going to back up and read the part of it.
I'm going to go from verse 40 to the end, 46. And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, insomuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me not in. Naked, and ye clothed me not. Sick and in prison, and ye visited me not. Then shall they say, and also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered, or athirst, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, insomuch as ye did not to one of the least of these, ye did not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Okay. So he laid it out for him. He was
he's been spending the last few chapters laying
being
it
very
out
blunt. You had a job to do. I get my people were there. My people were in need, and you didn't do it.
Right.
And he's really talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees.
He's addressing the multitude. But by addressing the multitude in the way that he did, he was essentially condemning the leadership of the church, or the leadership of not the church then, but the leadership of the people, the leaders of Israel, the scribes, Pharisees, high priests, those kind of people.
And remember, we've talked back before in Matthew that they put a big burden on the people, a burden that wasn't in God's word.
That's right.
That wasn't in God's law. It wasn't in the commandments. And they interpreted it and added to it.
And
so he's laying the burden back on them.
Yeah. They not only didn't, as Jesus put it, they not only didn't go into the kingdom or didn't go into the fellowship with God, they prevented others from going in, which made it even that much worse. So Jesus, in the first two verses, after he finished talking to them, he addressed the disciples, because he'd been talking to the multitudes for the past couple of chapters, and he addressed the disciples now, because they're probably getting a little worried at the way Jesus is addressing people. He's criticizing people that can have you thrown in prison, kicked out of the temple, or stoned. And so they're a little concerned, I'm betting. That's conjecture on my part, but I would be. And so Jesus, he said, in verse 2, he says, As you know, the Passover celebration begins in 2 days, and I shall be betrayed and crucified. Now, he's doing two things. Number one, he's reminding them that he's going to be betrayed and crucified. He has told them this before. He's told them that he's going to die. He's told them that he's going to be betrayed. Now he's telling them specifically he's going to be crucified, which is a horrible way to die. Absolutely horrible way to die.
And remember, that was... it was held out for people who broke the law. The lowest of the low were crucified.
Yeah, thieves, murderers.
So they weren't thinking that this was... First of all, I don't think they believed it was really going to happen, because they didn't think he was that he was a murderer, a thief.
Well, it says in the Old Testament, and I don't remember exactly where, it's probably in Deuteronomy, but it says anybody that hangs on a tree is cursed.
And they wouldn't want to think of Jesus as cursed.
Right. But he is telling them that's what's going to happen. But he's also telling them, don't worry, they're not going to do anything just yet. I've got a few days. They're not going to do anything just yet. And then it cuts to, in 3 through 5, it cuts to, it's like a movie scene if you're familiar with movies. I'm going to use that terminology, because we have a scene here with him with the disciples and multitude, and then it cuts the scene. It goes over, it shifts on who's it's got in the frame. And it shifts over to the chief priests and the elders, and they meet with Caiaphas, the high priest.
I'm going to go back to something you just said, and then I'm going to read some Old Testament scripture for verse 3.
Okay.
What came to my mind when you said it's cursed? They weren't yet understanding that Jesus had to take the curse.
Right. He took the curse that we're under onto him.
So being crucified we know now that, or we can think now, he took that curse for us. They weren't yet to understand that, but that he had to be crucified because we were under a curse. We were under sin without a sacrifice yet.
That's right. Now, in verse 3 through 5, it's dealing with, like I said, a cut scene. It goes over to the chief priests and the scribes meeting together in the house of the high priest named Caiaphas at the time.
Okay, so for verse 3, it goes back to Psalms 2, verses 2 and 3. The kings of the earth set themselves, and rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us.
Okay.
They were, that's pretty serious.
Yeah, they're joining together to go against God deliberately.
And I think it's important, something we discussed earlier, that Caiaphas wasn't of the line.
Caiaphas shouldn't, if my understanding, what I was taught about the history in here, Caiaphas was not even eligible to be a high priest.
No.
He was placed in that position politically by the Romans, or maybe Pilate himself, or King Herod. I don't exactly know who put him there. But he was put there for political reasons. I'm not even sure he was a Levi, but he was definitely not from the line of Aaron.
And had no authority. And this is important. I wanted to make sure that was said because later on we're going to address that. But
wasn't rightfully in the position of high priest. Jesus never said anything bad about him to us. He never disrespected the title and the position of high priest. He respected the position, as he should, as they all should. And whether he should have been there or not, that's for God to deal with, not for the people. They respected the position that he was in, and expected him to fulfill it. By the way, and in verse 5, they get together and they decide to kill him. Under whatever pretense they can come up with. They've already so the trial that happens later is a kangaroo court. They've already decided that he's dead. They're going to kill him for something, but they don't want to do it on the feast day during Passover, which is coming up. They don't want to do it then because it would look bad.
As though it didn't already look bad.
That's my thinking when I'm reading that is if they truly believed Jesus was blaspheming, if they truly believed he was preaching heresy in the temple, they would have executed him and stoned him at the moment. They would not, or arrested him at least. They wouldn't have waited till after the feast days because it didn't look right.
But they knew his words. He spoke what was in Scripture. They weren't ready to. They said they wanted a Messiah. They wanted the Messiah to come, but I don't think they really did.
Yeah. No, because the Messiah coming means they lose their power. But anyway, so Jesus can. So it's kind of a cut screen. Now it cuts back. Since they're doing that, we come back to Jesus and his disciples. Now it says Jesus in verse 6 through 13 is my next grouping. But it's and my title for it is Jesus is anointed for his burial. But it says in verse 6 says Jesus now proceeded to Bethany, which is a little town outside of Jerusalem, to the home of Simon the leper. Now, see, this struck me just funny in itself. There is not a single religious leader in all of Israel that would go to a leper's house.
True.
Now, in this case, it's a former leper, but he still has that title.
Well, and leprosy wasn't, it could be a death sentence, but there were people that did what they were supposed to do and stopped it before the disease just took over.
But I think in this case, Jesus healed Simon.
As I say, there's some that were just healed.
He healed Simon, I believe. He was one of the ones that he healed.
But again, it's because Simon did what Jesus told him to do. I think Simon's the one that had to go to the water, and
I think he had to go dip in the water. Anyway, I think that was him. Anyway, I don't know. But it says that Simon the leper. But it's kind of like blind Bartimaeus. He wasn't blind after he met Jesus, but he kept the title. And so I think that's what we're dealing with. But anyway, either way, it wouldn't have mattered how long ago he was a leper. There's not a single one of those religious leaders that would have went into his house. And it looks like he went into his house more than just went into his house. He went and had dinner with him. That's what it looks like. It looks like he was staying there. Because while he was eating, it says, this woman came and poured a bottle of expensive, probably alabaster oil, I think, from other scriptures. But anyway, a bunch of oil, really expensive oil on him. And his disciples got upset. And they said, look, we could have sold that. We could have sold that. She could have sold that. And we could have used the money to benefit the poor and, all the good stuff. And Jesus rebuked them. And I got some things out of this. And number one, I told you, he was in the house of a leper. What was he doing there? Well, Jesus didn't mind going to the house of a leper because Jesus wasn't afraid of leprosy. He would just heal him of the leprosy and we'll move on with our lives. But Jesus went to the sick. He went to the helpless. He went to those that were hurting. And he wasn't afraid of being around them. They did not make him unclean because they were having trouble. But number two, the disciples' response to it, to what she was doing. And a lot of Christians fall into this category as well, and a lot of other people do too. They were being very generous to the poor with somebody else's money. That's wrong. That's right up next to theft. It's incorrect. And Jesus, I made a note down here. Jesus never once condemned anybody for doing whatever it was they wanted to do with their own money.
Yeah, and if what you're doing, I mean, if you're going to be patted on your back because you took somebody else's money and did something good with it, okay, well, there's a little bit of praise for that. But if you're not willing to put part of yourself into it, and that's what Jesus is saying, give from yourself. And we've talked before, God can't bless you again if you're going to hold on to yours and hoard it.
But see, he did say you would lose blessing. You wouldn't be as blessed.
Right.
But he never told you couldn't do it. It's yours.
Right.
It's yours to do with as you please. He never condemned anybody for doing what they wanted to with their own money and their own property. But they could receive so much more, is what he's trying to explain to them.
But these people speaking out and as though they should be indignant about it, that is wrong.
Yeah. And Jesus rebuked them for it. And that's the third thing that comes to mind, Jesus' rebuke and his praise. He rebuked the disciples. Number one, they were being generous with somebody else's money. But number two, he goes, the poor you have with you always. Now that's a hard rebuke. The poor is always there. What have you been doing? The poor has always been there. They were there before I got here. They were there now. They're going to be in the future. What have you been doing for the poor? Now you got to remember, at least 5 of the 12 disciples were of means. They weren't poor. They came from money. They were successful businessmen. Matthew himself, the author of this book, was a tax collector. He was a wealthy man. When he went to follow Jesus, he already had a lot of wealth accumulated. He was a wealthy man. Peter and Andrew Peter owned his own house in a very good place in Galilee.
Yes.
They owned their own fishing business. The sons of Zebedee, James and John, were the sons of a man who owned a fishing fleet. I mean, these were not poor people. Now, some of the others may have been poor, but these were good, solid working class, or even Matthew may have been wealthy. So what have you been doing? What did you do? And it's kind of a subtle rebuke to them. That's her money. What do you do with yours? But the other one is the praise he gave to the woman. And it may have been Martha. It doesn't say in Matthew.
It doesn't say who it was.
Did he not? And it's also part of the rebuke here and the praise to her. Didn't he tell him he was going to die? He just told him he was going to die again at the beginning of this chapter. He told him he was going to die. She was in mourning for his coming death. She anointed him for his coming burial. She believed Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And because of her belief and her faith in what he told her, she got recorded in all the Gospels.
It would always be remembered.
And that was the reward and part of the praise that Jesus gave her, was that anytime somebody told the story or the good news or was told of the gospel or told about Jesus, she would be remembered. She would be mentioned. And the reason she was immortalized was for her faith. She believed. Jesus said he was going to go die and crucified. She believed him.
Mm-hmm.
He said it. She believed it. And she acted accordingly. There's a difference between believing and acting.
Mm-hmm.
She put her faith into action. What do they say? Put feet to your faith. She did something. She believed something strongly enough that she did something. And I think if you truly believe something, you'll act on it. You won't have any choice. You'll just, and you won't even.
It's in your heart,
and it's not something you have to think about. You'll just do it because it's what you believe.
Put your faith in him.
Did you have anything for that section?
Are you on verse 17?
Nope, not yet.
Okay.
And then we get to the next section, 14 through 16. And in this area, Judas, it says Judas went and looked for the elders, for the chief priests. He went and looked for them. They didn't come and offer him money. He went to them and said, "What's your price? How much will you give me?" Judas is known to be a thief. He is also their treasurer. He's in charge of the money box. But the other disciples knows he steals from it. So he's already known that. He likes money a little too much. Judas likes money a little too much. And so I don't know what I don't remember what Judas's background is, but he liked money a little too much. But then it says, for the love of money is the root of all evil. But in this case, his love for money caused him to betray Christ. And so he asked how much.
But there are other things that I have seen about Judas. He had the idea that Christ's coming meant it was a war, that he was going to overpower or destroy everything right then, and he wanted to push for that.
Now, and that is not something new or something singular to Judas.
No.
That was believed by all of the Jews at the time, because that's what they were taught.
It's what they wanted.
And I think they're still taught that, by the way. They're still taught that when Jesus comes, he will set up his earthly kingdom. Well, now they're correct, but they weren't at the time. They weren't talking about a suffering Messiah that needed to die for their sins. They still don't preach that. But what they do preach is that he's going to set up his kingdom on this earth, and they will be, all their enemies will be trampled under their feet. Well, that will happen. And it's coming, but that hasn't happened yet. And at this time, they're denying who he is. But Judas and Peter, by the way, they both believe this.
Yes. And I guess what I'm trying to say is,
they've been waiting for him to start the war and set up his kingdom and fight the Romans.
There may have been some part of him that thought he could force it.
I think he was trying to force it. I think that's one of the ways. It says the devil came in him and he was deceived. And I think that's one of the ways he was deceived. I think that's the major way he was deceived. If you can put the push in, Jesus will have to act. And he will have to set up his kingdom. You can instigate the war.
But even in that, God knew he was going to use it.
Yes. And but they agreed on a price of 30 pieces of silver. And it struck me as funny. They already know who Jesus is. They don't need him to they don't. My phone gave a message across the bottom. They don't need him to. What was that?
Sorry, our cat's talking to us.
But they don't need him to identify Jesus. They already know who he is. So they're needing something more than just that. And I'm not sure all in total what that was. But they need more than just someone to betray him. They need someone that knew him well for whatever reason. And did you have a verse for 17?
I do.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, talk a little bit about 17.
Okay. 17. It's 17 on the first day of the Passover ceremonies. They're getting started. It's a festival time period. It's not just a singular day. But the disciples need to make ready for the Passover meal. And they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go because they're over in Bethany now in Jerusalem in that area. This is not Galilee where they
would have had. They would have been able to found a house, right?
In Galilee, they could have just went to Peter's house,
right?
Or anywhere there they could do that.
Or
but now they or Matthew's house or whatever. They got places there. Here, not so much. So they know what needs to be done, but they don't know where, when, and how. And many Christians and many churches come into the same problem. They know what needs to be done. They just don't know when, where, and how. And so where you go wrong and where you do what I say, put your hands on what God's doing, take your hands off, they go decide on themselves what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, instead of doing what the disciples did here. The disciples simply turned to Jesus and said, what do we do? And he told them where to go, what to say. He specifically told them who to go talk to, what to tell him, and then to set up, and he would give them the room they needed, and then go set it up properly. And if people would just do that, we would have a whole lot less trouble. There would be a whole lot less problems in this world altogether if people would just go, I know what needs to be done or what I think needs to be done, and then ask Jesus what to do. And he'll tell you.
Verse 17, the Old Testament scripture is Exodus 12, verse 6. And ye shall keep it until the 4th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And that's a part of the Passover. It's just reminding them that this scripture, the tradition of the Passover that they received in the Old Testament didn't change. We don't necessarily follow it exactly, but we still celebrate and acknowledge what the Passover did. The Passover was God showing his strength. The Passover was him preparing his people to leave. And it does talk about, that one does talk about the...
Passover specifically was about salvation by the blood of the Lamb. And killing it in the evening. We're talking about Jesus knew he was the Passover lamb. That's right.
And this was the tradition. And we acknowledge that his life was given for us.
And so now they're prepared, they're ready. And so we move on down to, what was it? Verse 20. Yeah, right here in the middle. I got distracted in my notes, couldn't find myself. Verse 20 through 25. Jesus talks to them about who is going to be betrayed. The betrayer is revealed. And it says in verse 20, it says, that evening as they sat eating with the 12, he said, one of you will betray me. Now, he's been telling them he's going to die, he's going to be crucified, he's going to be, move that light a little further forward. Thank you. He was going to be betrayed, he was going to be betrayed, he's going to be crucified and all that. But now, he tells them, it's one of you. It's one of the 12. This is new. This is a shocker for everybody. It's one of us. But what struck me funny when it gets down to verse 22, it says they were all asking him, they were chilled in their hearts, and each one asked, if either vocally to him or in their hearts, is it me? And none of them pointed fingers at each other. Because remember, they didn't really like Matthew to begin with. He's a tax collector. Judas is a thief. Peter is boisterous and angry, and so are the sons of Zebedee. There was all kinds of reasons to point fingers at each other. None of them did that. They pointed their fingers at themselves. They were all terrified that they were going to fail Jesus. They were the ones that failed. They were the ones that betrayed him. They were afraid of that. And so they looked inward. And I'm thinking looking inward is why they didn't notice in verse 25 when Jesus said, is it me? And he said, yes. Well, because after that, they didn't do anything. Nobody moved. Nobody attacked Judas. Nobody did nothing. But they continued on with supper.
Let's go back. I'm going to read verse 24, and then there's two areas of scripture for 24. Verse 24, the Son of Man goeth as it is written of him, but woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Psalm 22:1 says, my God, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? And then Daniel 9:26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end there shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolation are determined.
Mm-hmm.
He was reminding them that there was going to be,
This had to happen.
yeah, that there would be a desolation. And we talked before, this is really referring more to
That
Jesus' body too.
Right. And it's talking about the Messiah being crucified, being killed.
Because he would be cut off and forsaken.
Yeah, but not for himself, for us.
Right, for
He's
us.
cut off for us. And this first part here, the verse Psalms 22:1 that she read, is what Jesus was quoting when he's on the cross, just before he died. But it said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? See, we see that as something different than what the Jews there would have seen it. They would have known he was quoting Psalms 22. They would have understand the entire, when he said that, they would have, because you ever hear somebody say a quote from a movie? They just say one random quote for a movie, and you remember the entire movie. Just in a flash, just like that. You remember the entire movie. But specifically that scene, and it's humorous, or sometimes sad, depending on what it is. The one I'm thinking in my head is humorous. It's chewing gum online and stuff. Anyway, it's from Blazing Saddles, but but you remember the entire movie, and you specifically that scene. So when they heard him quote Psalms 22:1, they knew the entire verse. They knew the entire chapter. They knew the 23rd Psalm. They knew the 21st Psalm. They knew these, and they put it into perspective. They knew what he was saying. And so it wasn't, and so they understood. Whereas some of us don't, because we don't know the entire passage that he was quoting.
Right, and
or the reference
they were truly
he was making.
beginning to realize the death was imminent. It was going to happen. I don't think they yet understood how, but.
And then you get to verse 26 through 29 is where I'm at. Let's see where I'm at. 26 through 9. 26 through 29 is what we call the Last Supper, or communion. It's where we refer to communion. This is quoted or read sometimes during communion, or a version of it from another gospel, if not this one. Where he took the bread and they broke it. It was his body. He took the blood and it was his. Took the wine and it represented his blood that was spilled for them, and they all took part in it, as we do now, and in remembrance, and do it always in remembrance of him. And we call it communion or the Lord's Supper, or even the Last Supper for that matter. But the Lord's Supper. But this is Passover. That's the word I was looking for. This is Passover. It's the Passover meal. Many Christians don't understand that what we consider the Lord's Supper is not new. This has been going on since they left Egypt. Israel has been celebrating this since they left Egypt. We're Christians are late to the party. We're to celebrating this, and they're celebrating the same thing we are. We just know his name.
Okay, I want to read 28 and 29, and then I have scripture from Exodus. For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the wine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Exodus 24, verse 8. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. We're talking about the covenant. Our communion is still in remembrance of
Absolutely.
fulfill of the part of that solidified that covenant is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. All right, and then we move on to 30 through 35. They sing a hymn. In case anybody wanted to know, Jesus sings. Jesus liked music. He sang. and they sang a hymn before they left the Passover, and they went over to, because they're worshiping God, remember? It's Passover. And they went to the Mount of Olives, and there Jesus informed them that they would all betray him that night. Not just the one. They would all abandon him. One would betray him, the rest of them would abandon him. And it was a fulfillment of prophecy, where the prophet said that the shepherd would be smited and the sheep would scatter.
And I'm going to read that.
Okay.
It's from Zechariah 13, verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man that is my fellow, saith the Lord of hosts. Smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered, and I will turn mine hand upon the little ones.
Mm-hmm. Now, they all denied it, and they all said, "No, we're not going to do that. We wouldn't abandon you. We're not going to do that." And Peter even jumped up and said, "Even if all these others abandon you, I won't." This is Peter relying on his own personal strength.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this is. This is self-reliance. Peter's demanding, showing that I'm strong enough. I can do it. I won't abandon you. I will be right there beside you the whole way. And Jesus informs him that the truth is, before the sun comes up, or the cock crows, that's when the cock crows, is when the sun comes up. Before morning, you'll deny me 3 times. That's more than anybody else will do. Everybody else will just scatter. You'll deny me 3 times, which is more than, you'll deny me worse than anybody else. And that cut Peter to the heart, I'm telling you. And he said, I would die first.
Yeah.
And Peter's right, but just not tonight.
Mm-hmm. You said he was trying to do it in his own strength.
Yes.
If all we understand is that Jesus died for our sins,
mm-hmm.
and we remain in that, in that, under that blood, under that, at the foot of the cross, if that's where you start,
mm-hmm.
just know it's not your strength. No matter what you do from that point on, it's not your strength alone.
That's right. Now, this is Peter, and the others said they would die before they abandoned him too, and they're all correct too, just not yet.
Mm-hmm.
But they all say that, but it's in their self-reliance, it's in their own strength, and we'll get to that. And you'll see later in Peter's life what happens when God gets a hold of him, when he relies on God's strength. But this is in Peter's strength, and we'll see how long Peter's strength lasts. Because we get to verse 36 and 43, or 46, 36 through 46. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know Garden of Gethsemane. That's where Jesus went to pray before he was crucified. And he goes there and he prays. And he leaves everybody and he says, I'm going to go pray. And he leaves there. He said, y'all wait here for me, except for you 3. He took Peter, James, and John with him. Now, Matthew calls them the sons of Zebedee in the King James, but we know the sons of Zebedee are James and John.
Mm-hmm.
So he took Peter, James, and John with him. His choice of the people he took struck me as interesting. Not only are they part of his inner circle, but if you look at him, Peter was the chief apostle. He became the chief apostle. Mm-hmm. He is going to be the first one to preach the gospel after Jesus' death.
Right.
He will be the first one. He will be the one that goes, according to history and tradition, he went to Babylon. And he preached the gospel in Babylon itself. The pit of hell on earth. The pit of hell on earth, as far as they were concerned. He went and preached there.
The heathen, the most
heathen place. And he was the first of the apostles to preach to the Gentiles. Okay? This is Peter. So Peter got chosen. James is the very first martyr. He's the first one to die for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
He's the first one. Judas dies before him, but Judas didn't die for Christ. James did. James was a martyr. He died for the faith. John, his brother, is the last one to die for the faith.
Mm-hmm.
So this is fun. So and it may not be interesting to anybody but me, but I find it very interesting. Jesus' choice. Was he prepping them for their role they were going to play? Did they need to hear him praying? Did they need to hear his weakness and his pleading with God and his submission to God's will?
And I think
they
also,
need to hear that?
There's a lot of things that speak about the agony that Jesus went through. There was just the start. I mean, he was brutally whipped and beaten before he was crucified.
Sure.
But his agony started then.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that's when God had to take hands off to a certain degree to let him be the lamb.
Well, you got to remember, Jesus was human.
Right.
He was no human wants nobody wants to die. No human wants to die. Even knowing where they're going, no one wants to die, and no one wants to go through a brutal death to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Ever. Nobody wants this. This goes completely against nature. So Jesus wanting to not do this was perfectly normal for a human. But his spirit comes in, and what he tells the apostle. Okay, we'll get to this, and I'll try to remember to come back in just a second. He goes and prays. Now, keep in mind, here's what a thought just occurred to me. It always says throughout the Gospels, it says Jesus went off alone to pray.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first time it was ever recorded that he took anybody with him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting the three he chose. That's what I'm getting at. It's interesting to me. But anyway, he leaves them to pray with him, and he goes off a little bit of distance from them, still not too far away. But
they could still see him.
They could probably still see him and probably still hear him. But he went over there to pray. And what he prays is, Lord, if it's God, if it's possible, Father, if it's possible for this cup to pass from me, if there be any other way,
mm-hmm.
let it be. However, nevertheless, thy will be done. You know, and I think those three needed to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to know that Jesus was suffering, Jesus was struggling, and I think it ties into what he came back to them to say.
Yes.
When he came back to them and found them asleep and he woke them up, he said, couldn't you pray for even an hour? But what he says is, and I love this part, and this is a whole sermon all on itself, I'm thinking. This is a whole purpose, because what Jesus says is, the spirit was willing, but the flesh is weak. And Jesus was struggling with that himself.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time. They couldn't even stay awake long enough to pray. But his spirit was willing, but his flesh was weak. And the reason he went to Gethsemane to pray, and he had to go pray 3 times. He prayed most of the night.
Mm-hmm.
The reason he had to do that was to get his flesh under control.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the flesh, he didn't want to die. He didn't want to do it in his flesh. In his spirit, he knew it had to happen. And his flesh was weak. And his flesh was weak. He prayed, and because he told them even, he said, "Pray so that you not be drawn into temptation."
Yeah, it says, "Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The
Mm-hmm.
spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak."
And I think Jesus himself was struggling with that himself. And so he wasn't only telling them; he was telling himself, and he went back to pray.
And I think I've heard people get upset about saying that Jesus was struggling.
Oh,
Jesus was tempted in the desert, but he didn't succumb to that temptation. This is another time that as a man would have been difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And as Sam said, he had to get that under control so that he could be the sacrifice, because it had to be sacrifice of
mm-hmm.
a man.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've had disagreements with people on this particular thing I'm just about to say, but I believe it's true, and it helps me greatly to understand it. If Jesus wasn't capable of failing, if he wasn't a man and he wasn't capable of failing, then the entire thing would have been for nothing.
That's right. Because
he wouldn't have overcome anything if he wasn't
right.
capable of failing. The truth is, he was very capable of failing, and he very much could have failed. He was born without the sin nature that we have, without the curse, but so was Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And Adam failed, and Jesus did not. Read Romans, I think it talks about it, or Corinthians. It talks about where one man failed. By one man we all went into sin,
right.
and by another one we went into glory.
Mm-hmm.
And they were both without the sin nature. They were both not under the curse of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Now Jesus was under the law, but he was not under the curse of the law. It was not under the curse. Neither one of them were. Adam failed. Jesus succeeded. And if he couldn't have failed, then it wouldn't have meant anything.
That's right. And it wouldn't have meant anything for those three.
And it wouldn't have meant anything for us when we're struggling in the flesh,
Right.
because sometimes our flesh. Who hasn't been in the situation where the spirit's willing but the flesh is weak? If you ever say that you've never been there, James has a word for you. He calls you a liar.
And tells you to get away.
Yeah, he calls you a liar. He says if you think that you have no sin, in no sin, then you're a liar and the truth is not in you. And James was the brother of Jesus. He grew up with the man. So
and the son of Mary.
Yeah, and he was. So I think they needed to hear this. They needed to know that even Jesus struggled getting the flesh under control. It was not something that was going to. It was not something that was going to cause them to be kicked out. In fact, Jesus didn't kick them out.
No.
Look at this. He caught them not doing what he asked them to do. Physically caught them sleeping instead of praying. And he didn't kick them out of the garden. He said he woke them up and told them to pray. Mm-hmm. He put them back into the position that they were supposed to be in to continue doing what he called them to do. There's a lesson. Now, the next time he came and caught them, he let them sleep. He went back to pray. And the third time he came back to them, he let them sleep until the betrayer came, which is in verse 46. He's the man, because he knew Judas was back. Judas is back and he's there. And in fact, he could probably hear him because a multitude was with him. He could probably hear him coming. And then we get to 47 through 54, which is where Judas betrays Jesus. And Judas shows up with all these people. He shows up with all these people with swords and staffs and spears. And this multitude from the chief priests, the Roman soldiers are here to arrest him. And Judas comes up and kisses him. Now, why did he have to kiss him? This is important. This is important. He could have just pointed at him and said, "There he is." No, everybody could have done that. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew who he was. Anybody could have pointed at him and said, "That's him." The priest could have done that. What they needed was somebody with an intimate relationship with him that was able to be in the circle to where he would be believed as a witness.
Okay. Verse 49, it's 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 9. And Job said to Amasa, "Art thou in health, my brother?" And Job took Amasa by the beard with the right hand to kiss him. Mm-hmm. And so they knew that it was going to be a kiss that would identify.
But this showed an intimate relationship. Mm-hmm. A betrayer or an informant doesn't mean much if they can't prove their position. And Judas was proving his position, if you will. And then Peter gets a little excited.
Well, I want to read something for verse 50, but I'm going to read verse 50. And Jesus said unto him, "Friend, wherefore art thou come?" And then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And Psalm 41, verse 9. Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me.
Mm. And if have eaten my bread and it was lift up a thing against me, that would probably have been Judas and the other disciples probably would have remembered that when he said, when he told him the betrayer is the one who dips his bread in the sauce with me. Mm-hmm. They remembered that verse, I'll guarantee it, because that was the betrayer. What?
Well, and he may not be quite at that verse.
Well, we're almost there. Okay. That's the put away your sword. Matthew doesn't say who it was. John does. The book of John says it was Peter that pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of the soldier. Why would he do that?
He was ready to fight.
He was ready to fight just as much as Judas was.
He was a man that was.
Now remember, he said he wouldn't leave him even in death. He would leave him. He would fight to the death with him. Is what he was saying.
But that's an honorable death.
Yeah.
In that kind of fight, if you die, it's an honorable death. I'm going to die that honorable death. I'm going to have that glory.
Yeah, and that's what Peter was ready to do. See, Peter and Judas aren't that far apart.
No.
There's a whole sermon on that, and I've preached it. Of it's not how you start, it's how you finish. Is the idea. Peter and Judas were not that far apart.
Well, and
they really weren't.
And he still doesn't understand what glory. He's looking for the glory of a warrior in the battle right now, and has to see the glory of the warrior that endures and sustains and walks a path and is much farther down.
And in 52, he says, this is where we get, live by the sword, die by the sword. This is what Jesus told him. Those who live by the sword shall die with the sword. Put it away. Put away your sword. And it goes on down to, which one do you want me to read?
53. You talked about 52.
Well, 53 says...
Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father?
Go ahead.
Okay. And he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels. But how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled that thus it must be?
Right. Jesus was already aware. Jesus was not helpless. He didn't need Peter to swing a sword. He was not helpless. He had the legions of angels. A legion is 10,000, and he could call 12 of them. That's 120,000 angels to fight these people. One angel with stepping foot on the earth will cause the earth to tremble and cause earthquakes. He could call 120,000 of them like that. And they would be there in a moment. He didn't need Peter to swing a sword.
Right.
He said, calm down. There's a prophecy that needs to be fulfilled.
So with verse 52, it's Genesis 9:6. And whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. And for verse 53, 2 Kings 6.
See what happens when we don't do it for a while?
I know.
You lose the ability to speak.
And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and beheld the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire around about Elisha. Which that is talking about, that's in reference to the angels.
Right. Peter couldn't see them, but Jesus knew they were there. He was surrounded by angels. He didn't need Peter to act as his bodyguard. So when we get to 55, 56, Jesus addresses these people that came to get him. He said, what? And I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, I was in the temple every day, and you come to get me in the middle of the night with soldiers and swords and staffs and a big multitude. You come to arrest little old me. I'm that scary. And you come in the night to do it so nobody can see? What are you doing? Wasn't I in the temple teaching daily? Why didn't you get me then? Who are you hiding from? And the reason he was doing it, he was pointing out their hypocrisy. Because like I said, if they really thought he was blaspheming, they would have grabbed him the day he did it. They wouldn't have hesitated. But they didn't, because they knew he wasn't. And so he called out their hypocrisy. And then in verse 56, all the disciples fled. Just like he told them they would. Their strength lasted about a couple hours. That's what it did.
Verse 56 is Lamentations 4:20. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Lord, was taken in their pits, of whom he said, under his shadow we shall live among the heathen. They forget that he knew what was going to happen, and that he would be taken, and that their strength, their own personal strength, wouldn't last. And
then you get to 57 through 68. 57 through 68. It's several verses, but basically it's Jesus' trial is essentially what we're dealing with here. They take him, and they take him to the high priest. Now, isn't it a strange time to have a trial? Especially when somebody's life, and we're doing it in the middle of the night when nobody's watching. This is a strange time to have a trial. But they took him, and they took him to the high priest's house, and Peter followed. Now, Peter did follow him. He's the only one recorded that did. And he did go into the high priest's house. He did go in and sit inside the house with the servants. So he was close enough to hear what was going on. And the chief priests, it says they tried desperately to find false witnesses against Jesus. And many came, but they found none. Which means lots of people showed up to testify. Lots of people were willing to be false, but they didn't have anything to say. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't catch him in anything.
Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity, or for any sin. In any sin that he sinneth, at the mouth of two witnesses shall the matter be established.
They finally found two. They finally found two. See, here's the problem. You can have a multitude of witnesses, false witnesses, but if you can't find at least two of them that agree
and that was the problem.
On something, they couldn't do anything. But they finally found two that said that were willing to say that Jesus said he could tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. That's not what Jesus said. He said they could destroy this temple and I can rebuild it in 3 days. He was talking about himself, not the Jewish temple. But that's what they said. And so the high priest stood up and said, said, what about it? Did you say it? That's guilty of death right there, just saying that. And Jesus didn't say anything. But then the high priest came and said, in the name of God, I command you, essentially is what he said. He said, beseech you in King James. But basically, I command you to tell me straightway and speak plainly, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? And Jesus said, yes. In so many words. He said, you've said it. He said, yes, I am. But after this, you won't see me until I come back in power.
Verse 63, Leviticus 5:1. And if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing, and it is a witness whether he had seen or known of it, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity.
And this made the high priest really mad. So instead of the high priest bowing down and worshiping and accepting Christ as the Messiah as he should have, he rent his clothes, he threw a big hissy fit, and he said, this man needs to die. And then they then they started mocking him and spitting on him and say, well, if you're the Son of God, tell you who spit on you. This is a very dangerous spot for people to be in.
Right. And remember, Caiaphas really didn't have that authority to speak that about him because he shouldn't have been.
But Jesus never disrespected the high priest.
He did never disrespect it. He respected what God placed as authority, and the authority was that position of high priest, not the person.
Now we're back to Peter. We're back to another cut screen. We go back to Peter. And Peter, after hearing all this going on, Peter is approached by a damsel. Not even a maiden, a damsel, a little girl. Right? He gets approached by a little girl, and she says, you were one of them. This is verses 69 through 75. She said, you were one of them. I can tell. I saw you with him. And he goes, I don't know what you're talking about, and moves away from her. So he was in the house. Now he's moved out to the porch. Watch this. He moves further and further away. He moves the porch. Out on the porch, he finds a maiden or a maid, a little older woman, a young woman, but older. And she says, you were with Jesus. I saw you. You were one of them. You're a Galilean. You're one of them. And, because there's really not that many Galileans in Jerusalem, to be honest. they kind of stayed in Galilee. And so she goes, you were one of them. And he goes, I don't know the man. And even swore an oath. Like, I swear I don't know him. I don't know what you're talking about. Then he gets approached, so he moves farther away. He gets approached by people in the surrounding group, and people in the surround says, I can tell by the way you talk. How many of us could be accused of being a Christian just by the way we talk?
How many of us should be accused of being a Christian by the way we talk?
We all should be, but they identified Peter. They knew he was a follower of Christ just simply by the way he talked. And so Peter, in response, started cussing like the sailor that he was. And started cussing like a sailor, changed his form of speech. And he started cussing like a sailor, saying, I don't know the man. And as soon as he said it the third time, the cock crowed. It was sunup. The sun had risen, and the cock crowed, and Peter remembered Jesus. And so he has 3 steps here of running from people, moving further away from Christ because he was afraid of the people. And then the cock crowed, reminded him of where he was, reminded him of what he was doing, and he remembered Jesus. And in the last verse, verse 35, it says he ran away and wept bitterly. In other words, he repented.
Yeah. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and he wept bitterly.
And keep in mind, so he ran away he moved away from Jesus, running from people because he was more afraid of people than he was of God. And then the cock crowed. Now he ran to Jesus. Not physically, but he ran to God.
In spirit.
And spirit, and he begged for forgiveness for what he had done. And to be quite honest, according to Scripture, that's the last time he ever ran from people.
Mm-hmm.
And
he was willing to. He thought he was willing to give his life. He was willing to give his life when he thought it was a glorious way, but he feared. We talked about it. Crucifixion is for thieves. It is for the vile, the most despised people. That's who were crucified, and it was a very painful death. Jesus took the everything vile about us upon himself, and even took that death, that vile, hated, despised death. Peter feared that part. He didn't fear dying in glory. He didn't understand dying in hatred, dying in anger, dying in disgust. And how can that be glorious for the Son of God? He couldn't quite understand that yet.
Yeah, but he did. And all these people, he's hearing them, and all these people in this area and listening to this trial. Jesus is being tried and convicted as a blasphemer and a heretic. And at this time, Peter doesn't want to be connected to a heretic. He's been believing in Christ, but he doesn't want to be connected to a heretic or a blasphemer. He doesn't want to be stoned. He's afraid. And it's not so much that he's afraid of dying, which he is, but it's also to be connected to something that's unholy. He doesn't want that either. But then when the cock crows, he remembers Jesus. And he remembers at that moment, it comes to him and it's in his heart. He was the one that said, "You are the Christ." He knew, no matter what all these people said, he knew Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus was the Christ. And no matter what else happened, Jesus was the Christ. And if that cost him his life, then so be it.
Right.
And he went and begged for God's forgiveness because he had left the path and he needed to get back on it.
And it is hard to fathom. I mean, I know if you've seen the movie The Passion of Christ, you saw how severely he was beaten and what it did to his body. But he had to take on the most evil of humanity. He had to take all that poured onto him and over him and die for it. And it wasn't considered a glorious death. It wasn't until after that it was glorious.
Yeah, it was ugly and it was painful. So it's not how you start, it's how you finish. Peter finished begging for forgiveness and repenting. Judas, I don't remember if it tells us in this chapter, in this book, but we do know that he went out and hung himself. And that's not a good ending. And
whether he had the opportunity to have a better ending or not, we don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that we have to remember that we have that.
Right. And to be honest, whether we're going to find Judas in heaven or not, I can't tell you. I don't know. That's not my call. Because you got to remember, he committed suicide out of desperation and out of despair. I personally believe that people don't commit suicide because they lost their faith. They commit suicide because they lost hope. There's a difference. There's a difference. And whether you'll find your suicided relatives or friends in heaven, there's a good chance you'll find them. I'll find quite a few of them. Because they didn't lose faith. They lost hope.
That one ends chapter 26.
And so we end chapter 26 with Peter finding his way back. All right. We'll see. Well, hopefully sooner than this last time. This one was quite a bit of a gap, and I apologize for that. But we'll be back with chapter 27. All right.